Maya Schenwar is the editor-in-chief of Truthout, and she was on sabbatical for about a year to write a book about prisons. The book is entitled Locked Down, Locked Out. Now, the book weaves in both personal narratives and current research. And when I say personal, I mean she includes stories about her own family's experience with her sister's imprisonment. Hello, Maya. Welcome back to Truthout Interviews.
Thanks so much, Ted.
Let's talk about your sister first. She was imprisoned, and what are the circumstances surrounding that imprisonment, and how did your friends, family, and acquaintances react to the news of this?
Well, she's actually been in and out of jail and prison for the past 9 years. So it's been a while since it was something new. And actually, she was one of the people, and this is very common, who started in juvenile detention. So she was incarcerated for the first time when she was 15. And for people who think of juvenile detention as kind of like school, but a little grittier, juvenile detention is jail. And so you go to juvenile detention, and an enormous number of people then graduate to adult prison. And so she was in that position and started kind of cycling through. And this was mainly due to the fact that she suffered a pretty severe heroin addiction. And I think that, it has played a major role in the way my family functions over the past 9 years. And this was really why I started digging into this subject, was that I think often the way we talk about prison, especially in the media, is very specific to particular issues. So we'll talk about the drug war, or we'll talk about mass incarceration, like the number of people who are imprisoned. But you see very little coverage of the way that prison affects all the other people surrounding those who are incarcerated. And that's really a huge number of people if you think about the fact that around 2.4 million people in this country are behind bars.
How did it affect your family personally?
My family is a little different than families of other prisoners, of most other prisoners, because we are middle class and white and had the resources to visit my sister in prison. A lot of families can't even make those visits because prisons are so far away. Usually they're located in very remote rural areas. But for us, it did become a regular and invasive and painful part of our lives, just these attempts to connect with my sister while she was incarcerated. And that's not just about visiting, although visiting, if you're trying to visit someone who's 4 hours away once a week in a prison, which, is, if you haven't visited a prison, is not a pleasant experience. It's kind of like being incarcerated for a day yourself. So even beyond the visits, I think there's this constant sense of like being on edge, being immersed in like the aura of incarceration. And part of that is you're always on the edge of your seat because you can't call your loved one. They have to call you. And you never know when it's going to happen, and they never know when they'll be allowed to call. So that is just like a concrete source of that. Another thing about it is that this person you love who's behind bars is constantly being traumatized. And that's partially, there's regular physical and sexual violence occurring in prison, even institutionalized violence like strip searches. But also just the act of being caged is a violent one. Caging a human being is just a violent act, and that's what's happening in prison.
You bring up a good point, and that is the lack of connection to other family members. You said that, you're sort of an atypical family in terms of the prison population and the families that are outside, in that you were able to make the journey to communicate with your sister. If the lines of communication are one way, meaning that the prisoner has to call family members, and it can happen at any time or at any moment, that a lot of times there may not be that connection. It'd be difficult to form those connections with family members. So that lack of connection compounds the experience of being, like you put it, in a cage. You have no contact with anyone that you knew prior to your imprisonment, and that must be its own special torture.
Exactly. And, you know, even if you could get visits all the time and phone calls all the time, it would still be nothing like being in the outside world. But the thing is that visits and phone calls and other types of contact, even letters, are all based on money. So prison phone calls are exorbitantly expensive in most places. For many families, they're prohibitive. And so phone calls from prison can be rare.
So can I ask you sort of a technical question about the phone calls? A prisoner calls a family member. The family member is charged for that phone call. Is that how it works?
It works differently in different states and also between county jails and state and federal prisons. But the way it works in state prisons often is that as a family member, you have an account with this private company that has a monopoly on prison phone calls. And so every time the person calls you from prison, money is deducted from your account. It's a huge scam, and the way it operates, it's kind of along the lines of a lot of things in prison where you're completely isolated and cut off, and then you have to buy back these tiny bits of connection. You know, so through phone calls, you're buying back a little bit. Some prisons now, they have video calls, which are extremely expensive. You're buying back a tiny bit.
The prison system, or industrial complex as some people are saying, is a business. The laws are written in such a way that it ensures a steady stream of inmates. And these companies that have a monopoly, say on the phone system, make huge profits. And, you know, we're not, and that's leaving out other things: clothing, food, heating, air conditioning, all this stuff. This is a big moneymaker for a lot of companies.
It's such a weird financial situation because on the one hand, private corporations are making a lot of money off of prisons. On the other hand, states are going bankrupt. So some people kind of conflate the two and have this sense, oh, well, the government is perpetuating this system because the state is profiting off it. Well, there are a few situations where the state profits off of it. Occasionally, the state government will get kickbacks from phone calls, for instance. But in a really basic sense right now, in financial terms, states are talking about how can we decrease the numbers of people who are incarcerated. But the prison lobby and prison corporations have a vested interest in continuing this system. I think another misconception is that the main involvement of corporations is in kind of private prisons. So everyone loves to talk about private prisons, especially liberals, right? Because it's like, corporations are ruling our lives, prisons are private. Really, most prisons are public. It's less than 10% that are privatized, and it's horrifying. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that public prisons generate profits also. All of the services that you mentioned are being supplied by companies who do have a stake in people remaining incarcerated. And so it's kind of all these factors coming together.
There's a lot that's going on here. The lack of connection, the socialization of prisoners in terms of cruelty. And then once, say, an inmate gets out, and you talked about this earlier, about your own sister cycling in and out of prison, that many prisoners, and you said the recidivism rate, and we talked about this prior to recording this, ranged from something like 40% to 75%. That's a huge range of people going back into a system that is inherently cruel and just sort of perpetuates this sort of, you will be a prisoner for the rest of your life. This is your job. This is your career, your vocation.
And one thing I mentioned earlier when I said my family is not typical, a big part of that is this financial element, right? Where like most prisoners' families are very, very poor. So that's affected by them going to prison because often the person being incarcerated is a major wage earner in the family, someone bringing in income. But then when they get out of prison, there's also a financial impact because now this person is usually a dependent. So they're getting out and they're kind of a weight on the family. It's very difficult for people who are incarcerated to come out and get jobs. In one recent study in New York, 70% of people on parole were unemployed. So it gives you an idea of like you come out and you're kind of paralyzed. And another thing I'll say about that is that there are all these restrictions beyond the fact that having a criminal record makes it difficult to apply for jobs. There are also restrictions on housing. In some cases, there are restrictions on public aid. There's definitely, in some states, there's even restrictions on voting. And you're not even, a lot of people say, a second-class citizen. You're really considered less than a person, someone who doesn't need their basic needs met.
And this comes to the sort of the last part of your book, and I'm not sure exactly where it fits in, but it's about rehabilitation, that there are a number of organizations in the United States and even outside the United States who make it their mission to do things to reintegrate former inmates into society. So those roadblocks that are set up, those barriers that are set up in society once you get out are not, they don't go away, but these organizations are trying to find ways around them to say, look, you did your time. You want to get on this, the proverbial straight and narrow. You want to reintegrate into society and not have a life that's always about prison or being a prisoner. You want to get on with your life, and here's a way to do it. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of these organizations and what they're doing.
So a lot of what I talk about in the second part of my book is different ways of envisioning responding to harm and violence that don't involve prison. So how can we take situations where people have done something that has hurt other people, which actually a lot of people in prison haven't, but dealing with the fact that there are people who've done that, how do you address that without prison? So some of the groups that I profile are emphasizing decarceration, like they're just talking about, okay, how do we shrink the prison system? How do we reduce prison budgets, close prisons, that kind of thing. Other groups are working directly with people and trying to involve them in projects that will address problems without prison. So, for example, there are projects that use restorative justice in schools. So this is an attempt to deal with things like fights that happen inside of school, kids that are acting out in class, maybe if a kid brings something potentially violent into the school, all these potentially difficult situations where oftentimes, especially in poor Black neighborhoods, the police are being called. And that kind of starts the school to prison pipeline. Well, these programs attempt to intervene and deal with this problem without law enforcement. I think it's really important to just give a little caveat that they don't work for everything. And I talk a lot in the book about how in some situations restorative justice can actually be harmful. Like there are cases of sexual assault where trying to force survivors to meet up with their perpetrators is actually can be re-traumatizing. So in a lot of cases, instead of restorative justice, we have to be even more creative and think about what's called transformative justice, which is just really a whole set of different solutions trying to think about how can we deal with our problems without the state or without prison. So it's a journey,
Certainly is. And from what I've read about the book and some of the excerpts from the book, it is quite the journey. The book is called Lockdown, Locked Out. by Maya Schenwar. Maya is the editor-in-chief of Truthout, and she's been my guest. You can get this book online or at your local bookstore. You just have them to order it and support local businesses. Maya, I want to thank you for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thanks so much, Ted.
And thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo. We'll see you next time.